The Lord of the World, Part 4, Chapter 3, Part 1. Old Mrs. Brand and Mabel were seated at a window of the new Admiralty offices in Trafalgar Square to see Oliver deliver his speech on the 50th anniversary of the passing of the Poor Laws Reform. It was an inspiriting sight, this bright June morning, to see the crowds gathering around Braithwaite's statue. That politician, dead 15 years before, was represented in his famous attitude, with arms outstretched and dropped down, his head up and one foot slightly advanced, and today was decked, as was becoming more and more usual on such occasions, in his Masonic insignia. It was he who had given immense impetus to that secret movement by his declaration in the House that the key of future progress and brotherhood of nations was in the hands of the order. It was through this alone that the false unity of the Church with its fantastic spiritual fraternity could be counteracted. St. Paul had been right, he declared, in his desire to break down the partition walls between nations, and wrong only in his exaltation of Jesus Christ. Thus he had preluded his speech on the poor law question, pointing to the true charity that existed among Masons apart from religious motive, and appealing to the famous benefactions on the continent. And in the enthusiasm of the bill's success, the order had received a great accession of members. Old Mrs. Brand was in her best today, and looked out with considerable excitement at the huge throng gathered to hear her son speak. A platform was erected round the bronze statue at such a height that the statesman appeared to be one of the speakers, though at a slightly higher elevation, and in this platform was hung with roses, surmounted by a sounding board, and set with a chair and table. The whole square round about was paved with heads and resonant with sound. The murmurs of thousands of voices, overpowered now and again by the crash of brass and thunder of the drums, as the benefit societies and democratic guilds, each headed by a banner, deployed from north, south, east, and west, and converged towards the wide railed space about the platform where the room was reserved for them. The windows on every side were packed with faces. Tall stands were erected along the front of the National Gallery and St. Martin's Church, garden beds of color behind the mute white statues that faced outward around the square. From Braithwaite in front, past the Victorians, John Davidson, John Burns, and the rest, round to Hampton and de Montfort towards the north. The old column was gone, with its lions. Nelson had not been found advantageous to the Entente Cordiale, nor the lions to the new art, and in their place stretched out a wide pavement broken by slopes of steps that led up to the National Gallery. Overhead the roof showed crowded friezes of heads against the blue summer sky. Not less than 100,000 persons, it was estimated in the evening papers, were collected within sight and sound of the platform by noon. As the clocks began to tell the hour, two figures appeared from behind the statue and came forward, and in an instant the murmurs of talk rose into cheering. Old Lord Pemberton came first, a gray-haired, upright man, whose father had been active in denouncing the House, of which he was a member on the occasion of its fall over 70 years ago, and his son had succeeded him worthily. This man was now a member of the government, and sat for Manchester. And it was he who was to be chairman of this auspicious occasion. Behind him came Oliver, bareheaded and spruce, and even at a distance his mother and wife could see his brisk movement, his sudden smile and nod as his name emerged from the storm of sound that surged around the platform. Lord Pemberton came forward, lifted his hand and made a signal, and in a moment the thin cheering died under the sudden roll of drums beneath that preluded the Masonic hymn. There was no doubt that these Londoners could sing. It was as if a giant voice hummed the sonorous melody, rising to enthusiasm until the music of massed bands followed it as the flag follows a flagstick. The hymn was one composed 10 years before, and all England was familiar with it. Old Mrs. Bland lifted the printed paper mechanically to her eyes and saw the words that she knew so well. The Lord that dwells in earth and sea. She glanced down the verses, and from the humanitarian point of view had been composed with both skill and ardor. They had a religious ring. The unintelligent Christian could sing them without a qualm, yet their sense was plain enough. The old human creed that man was all, even Christ's, words themselves were quoted. The kingdom of God, it was said, lay within the human heart. The greatest of all graces was charity. She glanced at Mabel and saw that the girl was singing with all her might, her eyes fixed on her husband's dark figure 100 yards away, and her soul pouring through them. So the mother, too, began to move her lips in chorus with that vast volume of sound. As the hymn died away, and before the cheering could begin again, old Lord Pemberton was standing forward on the edge of the platform, and his thin, metallic voice piped a sentence or two across the tinkling splash of the fountains behind him. Then he stepped back, and Oliver came forward. It was too far for the two to hear what was said, but Mabel slipped a paper, smiling tremulously, into the old lady's hand, and herself bent forward to listen. Old Mrs. Brand looked at that too, knowing that it was analysis of her son's speech, and aware that she would not be able to hear his words. There was an exordium first, congratulating all who were present to do honor to the great man who presided from his pedestal on the occasion of this great anniversary. Then there came a retrospect, comparing the old state of England with the present. 50 years ago, the speaker said, poverty was still a disgrace, and now it was so no longer. It was in the causes that led to poverty that the disgrace or the merit lay. Who would not honor a man worn out in the service of his country, or overcome at last by circumstances against which his efforts could not prevail? He enumerated the reforms passed 50 years before, on this very day, by which the nation once and for all declared the glory of poverty and man's sympathy with the unfortunate. So he had told them he was going to sing the praise of patient poverty and its reward, and that, he supposed, together with a few periods on the reform of the prison laws, would reform the first half of his speech. The second part was to be a panegyric of Braithwaite, treating him as the precursor of a movement that even now had begun. Old Mrs. Brand leaned back in her seat and looked about her. The window where they sat had been reserved for them. 2 armchairs filled the space, but immediately behind there were others, standing very silent now, craning forward, watching, too. with parted lips. A couple of women with an old man directly behind, and other faces visible again behind them. Their obvious absorption made the little lady a little ashamed of herself, and she turned resolutely once more to the square. Ah, he was working up now to his panegyric. The tiny dark figure was back, a yard nearer the statue, and as she looked, his hand went up and he wheeled, pointing, as a murmur of applause drowned for an instant the minute, resonant voice. Then again he was forward, half crouching, for he was a born actor, and a storm of laughter rippled around the throngs of heads. She heard an indrawn hiss behind her chair, and the next instant an exclamation from Mabel. What was that? There was a sharp crack, and the tiny gesticulating figure staggered back a step. The old man at the table was up in a moment, and simultaneously a violent commotion bubbled and heaved like water about a rock, at a point in the crowd immediately outside the railed space where the bands were massed, and directly opposite the front of the platform. Mrs. Brand, bewildered and dazed, found herself standing up, clutching the window rail, while the girl gripped her, crying out something she could not understand. A great roaring filled the square. The heads tossed this way and that, like corn under a squall of wind. Then Oliver was forward again, pointing and crying out, for she could see his gestures, and she sank back quickly, the blood racing through her old veins, and her heart hammering at the base of her throat. My dear, what is it?" she sobbed. But Mabel was up too, staring out at her husband, and a quick babble of talk and exclamations from behind made itself audible in spite of the roaring tumult of the square. Part 2. Oliver told them the explanation for the whole affair that evening at home, leaning back in his chair, with one arm bandaged and in a sling. They had not been able to get near him at the time. The excitement in the square had been too fierce, but a messenger had come to his wife with the news that her husband was only slightly wounded and was in the hands of doctors. "He was a Catholic," explained the drawn-faced Oliver. "He must have come ready, for his repeater was found loaded. Well, there was no chance for a priest this time." Mabel nodded slowly. She had read of the man's fate on the placards. "He was killed, trampled and strangled instantly," said Oliver. "I did what I could. You saw me. But, well, I dare say it was more merciful." "But you did what you could, my dear," said the old lady, anxiously from her corner. "I called out to them, mother, but they wouldn't hear me." Mabel leaned forward. "Oliver, I know this sounds stupid of me, but I wish they had not killed him." Oliver smiled at her. He knew this tender trait in her. "It would have been more perfect if they had not," she said. She then broke off and sat back. "Why did he just shoot just then?" she asked. Oliver turned his eyes for an instant towards his mother, but she was knitting tranquilly. Then he answered with a curious deliberateness. "I said that Braithwaite had done more for the world by one speech than Jesus and all his saints put together. He was aware that the knitting needle stopped for a second, then they went on again as before. But he must have meant to do it anyhow," continued Oliver. "How do they know he was a Catholic?" asked the girl again. "There was a rosary on him, and then he just had time to call on his God." "And nothing more is known?" Nothing more. He was well dressed, though. Oliver leaned back a little wearily and closed his eyes. His arm still throbbed intolerably. But he was very happy at heart. It was true that he had been wounded by a fanatic, but he was not sorry to bear pain in such a cause, as it was obvious that the sympathy of England was with him. Mr. Phillips even now was busy in the next room, answering the telegrams that poured in every moment. Caldecott, the Prime Minister, Maxwell, Snowford, and a dozen others had wired instantly their congratulations, and from every part of England streamed in message after message. It was an immense stroke for the Communists. Their spokesman had been assaulted during the discharge of his duty, speaking in defense of his principles. It was an incalculable gain for them, and a loss for the individualists, that confessors were not on all one side after all. The huge electric placards over London had winked out the facts in Esperanto as Oliver stepped into the train at twilight. Oliver Brand wounded, Catholic assailant, indignation of the country, well-deserved fate of assassin. He was pleased, too, that he honestly had done his best to save the man. Even in that moment of sudden and acute pain, he had cried out for a fair trial, but he had been too late. He had seen the staring eyes roll up in the crimson face, and the horrid grin come and go as the hands had clutched and torn at his throat. Then the face had vanished, and a heavy trampling began where it had disappeared. Oh, there was some passion and loyalty left in England. His mother got up and presently and went out, still without a word, and Mabel turned to him, laying a hand on his knee. "Are you too tired to talk, my dear?" He opened his eyes. "Of course not, my darling. What is it? What do you think will be the effect?" He raised himself a little, looking out as usual through the darkening windows, on to that astonishing view. Everywhere now lights were glowing, a sea of mellow moons just above the houses, and above the mysterious heavy blue of a summer evening. "The effect?" he said. "It can be nothing but good. It was time that something happened. My dear, I feel very downcast sometimes, as you know. Well, I do not think I shall be again. I have been afraid sometimes that we were losing all our spirit, and that the old Tories were partly right when they prophesied what communism would do. But after this, well, we have shown that we can shed our blood too. It is in the nick of time too, just at the crisis. I don't want to exaggerate, it is only a scratch, but it was so deliberate and so dramatic. The poor devil could not have chosen a worse moment. The people won't forget it." Mabel's eyes shone with pleasure. "You poor dear," she said. "Are you in pain?" "Not much. Besides, Christ, what do I care? If only this infernal Eastern affair would end." He knew he was feverish and irritable, and made a great effort to drive it down. "Oh, my dear," he went on, flushed a little, "if they would not be such heavy fools. They don't understand. They don't understand." "Yes, Oliver?" "They don't understand what a glorious thing at all is humanity, life, truth at last, and the death of folly. But haven't I told them 100 times?" She looked at him with kindling eyes. She loved to see him like this, his confident, flushed face, the enthusiasm in his blue eyes, and the knowledge of his pain pricked her feeling with passion. She bent forward and kissed him suddenly. "My dear, I am so proud of you. Oh, Oliver." He said nothing, but she could see what she loved to see, that response to her own heart. So they sat in silence while the dark sky darkened yet more, and the click of the writer in the next room told them that the world was alive and that they had its share in its affairs. Oliver stirred presently. "Did you notice anything just now, sweetheart, when I said that about Jesus Christ?" She stopped knitting for a moment, said the girl. He nodded. "You saw that too, then? Mabel, do you think she is falling back?" "Oh, she is getting old," said the girl lightly. "Of course she looks back a little. But you don't think it would be too awful?" She shook her head. "No, no, my dear. You're excited and tired. It's just a little sentiment. Oliver, I don't think I would say that kind of thing before her. But she hears it everywhere now." "No, she doesn't. Remember, she hardly ever goes out. Besides, she hates it. After all, she was brought up a Catholic." Oliver nodded and lay back again, looking dreamily out. Isn't it astonishing the way in which suggestion lasts? She can't get it out of her head, even after 50 years. Well, watch her, won't you? By the way, yes? There's a little more news from the East. They say Felsenburgh's running the whole thing now. The Empire is sending him everywhere. Tobolsk, Benares, Yatusk. Everywhere. He's been to Australia." Mabel sat up briskly. "Is that very hopeful?" "I suppose so. There's no doubt that the Sufis are winning. But for how long is another question. Besides, the troops don't disperse." "And Europe?" "Europe is arming as fast as possible. I hear we are to meet the powers next week at Paris. I must go." "Your arm, my dear?" "My arm must get well. It will have to go with me anyhow." "Tell me some more." "There is no more. But it is just as certain as it can be that this is the crisis. If the East can be persuaded to hold its hand now, it will never be likely to raise it again. It will mean free trade all over the world, I suppose, and all that kind of thing. But if not, well, if not, there will be a catastrophe such as never has been imagined. The whole human race will be at war, and either East or West will simply be wiped out. These new Benenschein explosives will make certain of that." "But is it absolutely certain that the East has got them?" "Absolutely. Benenschein sold them simultaneously to East and West. Then he died, luckily for him." Mabel had heard this kind of talk before, but her imagination simply refused to grasp it. A duel of East and West under these new conditions was an unthinkable thing. There had been no European war within living memory, and the Eastern wars of the last century had been under the old conditions. Now, if tales were true, entire towns would be destroyed with a single shell. The new conditions were unimaginable. Military experts prophesied extravagantly. contradicting one another on the vital points. The whole procedure of war was a matter of theory. There were no precedents with which to compare it. It was as if archers disputed as to the results of cordite. Only one thing was certain, that the East had every modern engine, and, as regards male population, half as much again as the rest of the world put together. And the conclusion to be drawn from these premises was not reassuring to England. But imagination simply refused to speak. The daily papers had a short, careful, leading article every day, founded upon the scraps of news that stole out from the conferences on the other side of the world. Felsenburgh's name appeared more and more frequently than ever. Otherwise there seemed to be a kind of hush. Nothing suffered very much. Trade went on. European stocks were not appreciably lower than before. Men still built houses, married wives, begat sons and daughters, did their business and went to the theater, for the mere reason that there was no good in anything else. They could neither save nor precipitate the situation. It was on too large a scale. Occasionally people went mad. People who had once succeeded in goading their imagination to a height whence a glimpse of reality could be obtained. And there was a diffused atmosphere of tenseness. But that was all. Not many speeches were made on the subject. It had been found inadvisable. After all, there was nothing to do but to wait. Three. Mabel remembered her husband's advice to watch, and for a few days did her best. But there was nothing that alarmed her. The old lady was a little quiet, perhaps, but went about her minute affairs as usual. She asked the girl to read to her sometimes, and listened unblenching to whatever was offered her. She attended the kitchen daily, organized varieties of foods, and appeared interested in all that concerned her son. She packed his bag with her own hands, set out his furs for the swift flight to Paris, and waved to him from the window as he went down the little path towards the junction. He would be gone 3 days, he said. It was on the evening of the second day that she fell ill, and Mabel, running upstairs, in alarm at the message of the servant, found her rather flushed and agitated in her chair. "It is nothing, my dear," said the old lady tremulously, and she added the description of a symptom or two. Mabel got her to bed, sent for the doctor, and sat down to wait. She was sincerely fond of the old lady, and had always found her presence in the house a rather sort of delight. The effect of her upon the mind was that of an easy chair upon the body. The old lady was so tranquil and human, so absorbed in small external matters, so reminiscent now and then of the days of her youth, so utterly without resentment or peevishness. It seemed curiously pathetic to the girl to watch that quiet old spirit approach its extinction, or rather, as Mabel believed, its loss of personality and the reabsorption into the spirit of life which informed the world. She found less difficulty in contemplating the end of a vigorous soul, for in that case she imagined a kind of energetic rush of force back into the origin of things. But in this peaceful old lady there was so little energy. Her whole point, so to speak, lay in the delicate little fabric of personality, built out of fragile things into an entity far more significant than the sum of its component parts. The death of a flower, reflected Mabel, is sadder than the death of a lion. The breaking of a piece of china more irreparable than the ruin of a palace. It is syncope, said the doctor when he came in. She may die at any time. She may live for 10 years. There is no need to telegraph for Mr. Brand. He made a little deprecating movement with his hands. It is not certain that she will die. It is not imminent, she asked. No, no. She may live 10 years, I said. He added a word or two advice as to the use of the oxygen injector and went away. The old lady was lying quietly in bed when the girl went up and put out a wrinkled hand. "Well, my dear?" she asked. "Just a little weakness, mother. You must lie quiet and do nothing. Shall I read to you?" "No, my dear. I will think a little." It was no part of Mabel's idea to duty to tell her that she was in danger, for there was no past to set straight, no judge was to be confronted. Death was an ending, not a beginning. It was a peaceful gospel. At least it became peaceful as soon as the end had come. So the girl went downstairs once more, with a quiet little ache in her heart that refused to be still. What a strange and beautiful thing death was, she told herself, this resolution of a cord that had hung suspended for 30, 50, 70 years, back again into the stillness of the huge instrument that was all in all to itself. Those same notes would be struck again, were being struck again even now all over the world, though with an infinite delicacy of difference in the touch. But that particular emotion was gone. It was foolish to think that it was sounding eternally elsewhere, for there was no elsewhere. She too, herself, would cease one day. Let her see to it that the tone was pure and lovely. Mr. Phillips arrived the next morning as usual, just as Mabel had left the old lady's room, and asked news of her. "She is a little better, I think," said Mabel. "She must be very quiet all day." The secretary bowed and turned aside into Oliver's room, where a heap of letters lay to be answered. A couple of hours later, as Mabel went upstairs once more, she met Mr. Phillips coming down. He looked a little flushed under his sallow skin. "Mrs. Brand sent for me," he said. "She wished to know whether Mr. Oliver would be back tonight." "He will he not? Have you not heard? Mr. Brand said he would be here for a late dinner. He will reach London at 19. "And is there any other news?" He compressed his lips. "There are rumors," he said. "Mr. Brand wired to me an hour ago." He seemed moved at something, and Mabel looked to him in astonishment. "It is not Eastern news?" she asked. His eyebrows wrinkled a little. "You must forgive me, Mrs. Brand," he said. "I'm not at all at liberty to say anything." She was not offended, for she trusted her husband too well. But she went on into the sick-room with her heart beating. The old lady, too, seemed excited. She lay in bed with a clear flush in her white cheeks, and hardly smiled at all to the girl's greeting. "Well, you have seen Mr. Phillips, then?" said Mabel. Old Mrs. Brand looked at her sharply an instant, but said nothing. "Don't excite yourself, Mother. Oliver will be back tonight." The old lady drew a long breath. "Don't trouble about me, my dear," she said. "I shall do very well now. He will be back to dinner, will he not? If the volor is not late. Now, Mother, are you ready for breakfast?" Mabel passed an afternoon of considerable agitation. It was certain that something had happened. The secretary, who breakfasted with her in the parlor looking out into the garden, had appeared strangely excited. He had told her that he would be away for the rest of the day. Mr. Oliver had given him his instructions. He had refrained from all discussion of the Eastern question, and he had given her no news of the Paris convention. He only repeated that Mr. Oliver would be back that night. Then he had gone in a hurry a half-hour later. The old lady seemed asleep when the girl went up afterwards, and Mabel did not like to disturb her. Neither did she like to leave the house. So she walked by herself in the garden, thinking and hoping and fearing, till the long shadow lay across the path, and the tumbled platform of roofs was bathed in a dusty green haze from the west. As she came in, she took up the evening paper, but there was no news there except to the effect that the convention would close that afternoon. 20 o'clock came, but there was no sign of Oliver. The Paris volor should have arrived an hour before, but Mabel, staring out into the darkened heavens, had seen the stars come out like jewels one by one, but no slender-winged fish passed overhead. Of course she might have missed it, but there was no depending on its exact course. But she had seen it 100 times before, and wondered unreasonably why she had not seen it now. But she would not sit down to dinner, and paced up and down in her white dress, turning again and again to the window, listening to the soft rush of the trains, the faint hoots from the track, and the musical chords from the junction a mile away. The lights were up by now, and the vast sweep of the towns looked like fairyland between the earthly light and the heavenly darkness. Why did not Oliver come, or at least let her know why he did not? Once she went upstairs, miserably anxious herself, to reassure the old lady, and found her again very drowsy. "He has not come," she said. "I dare say he may be kept in Paris." The old face on the pillow nodded and murmured, and Mabel went down again. It was now an hour after dinner time. Oh, there were 100 things that might have kept him. He had often been later than this. He might have missed the volor he meant to catch. The convention might have been prolonged. He might be exhausted, and think it better to sleep in Paris after all, and have forgotten to wire. He might even have wired to Mr. Phillips, and the secretary have forgotten to pass on the message. She went at last, hopelessly, to the telephone, and looked at it. But there it was, that round, silent month, that little row of labeled buttons. She decided to touch them one by one and inquire whether anything had been heard of her husband. There was his club, his office in Whitehall, Mr. Phillips' house, Parliament House, and the rest. But she hesitated, telling herself to be patient. Oliver hated interference, and he would surely soon remember and leave her and relieve her anxiety. Then, even as she turned away, the bell rang sharply, and a white label flashed into sight, Whitehall. She pressed the corresponding button, and, her hand shaking so much that she could scarcely hold the receiver to her ear, she listened. "Who is there?" Her heart leapt at the sound of her husband's voice, tiny and minute across the miles of wire. Mabel," she said, "alone here." "Oh, Mabel, very well. I am back, all is well. Now listen. Can you hear?" "Yes, yes." "The best has happened. It is all over in the East. Felsenburgh has done it. Now listen. I cannot come home tonight. It will be announced in Paul's house in 2 hours from now. We are communicating with the press. Come up here to me at once. You must be present. Can you hear?" "Oh, yes." "Come then at once. It'll be the greatest thing in history. Tell no one. Come before the rush begins. In half an hour the way will be stopped. Oliver." "Yes, quick." "Mother is ill. Shall I leave her?" "How ill?" "Oh, no immediate danger. The doctor has seen her." There was silence for a moment. "Yes, come then. We will go back tonight, anyhow, then. Tell her we shall be late." "Very well. Yes, you must come. Felsenburgh will be there." Chapter 4, Part 1. On the same afternoon, Percy received a visitor. There was nothing exceptional about him, and Percy, as he came downstairs in his walking dress, and looked at him in the light from the tall parlor window, came to no conclusion at all as to his business and person, except that he was not a Catholic. "You wish to see me," said the priest, indicating a chair. "I fear I must not stop long." "I shall not keep you long," said the stranger eagerly. "My business is done in 5 minutes." Percy waited with his eyes downcast. A certain person has sent me to you. She was a Catholic once. She wishes to return to the church." Percy made a little movement with his head. It was a message he did not very often receive in these days. "You will come, sir, will you not? Will you promise me?" The man seemed greatly agitated. His sallow face showed a little shining with sweat, and his eyes were piteous. "Of course I will come," said Percy, smiling. "Yes, sir. But you do not know who she is. It would make a great stir, sir, if it was known." "It must not be known, sir. You will promise me that too?" "I must not make any promise of that kind," said the priest gently. "I do not know the circumstances yet." The stranger licked his lips nervously. "Well, sir," he said hastily, "you will say nothing till you have seen her? Can you promise me that?" "Oh, certainly," said the priest. "Well, sir, you had better not know my name. It may make it easier for you and for me. And if you please, sir, the lady is ill. You must come today. if you please, but not until the evening. Will 20 o'clock be convenient, sir?" "Where is it?" asked Percy abruptly. It it is near Croydon Junction. I will write down the address presently." "And you will not come until 20 o'clock, sir?" "Why not now?" "Because the others may be there. They will be away then, I know that." It was rather suspicious, Percy thought. Discreditable plots have been known before. But he would not refuse outright. "Why does she not send for her parish priest?" he asked. She does not know who he is, sir. She saw you once in the cathedral, sir, and asked you for your name. Do you remember, sir? An old lady." Percy did dimly remember something of the kind a month or two before, but he could not be certain, and said so. "Well, sir, you will come, will you not?" "I must communicate with Father Dolan," said the priest, "if he gives me permission." "If you please, sir, Father Dolan must not know her name. You will not tell him?" "I do not know it myself yet," said the priest, smiling. The stranger sat back abruptly at that, and his face worked. "Well, sir, let me tell you first. This old lady's son is my employer, and a very prominent communist. She lives with him and his wife. The other two will be away tonight. That is why I'm asking you all this. And now, you will come, sir?" Percy looked at him steadily for a moment or two. Certainly, if this was a conspiracy, the conspirators were feeble folk. Then he answered, "I will come, sir. I promise. Now the name." The stranger again licked his lips nervously and glanced timidly from side to side. Then he seemed to gather his resolution. He leaned forward and whispered sharply, "The old lady's name is Brand, sir. The mother of Mr. Oliver Brand." For a moment Percy was bewildered. It was too extraordinary to be true. He knew Mr. Oliver Brand's name only too well. It was he who, by God's permission, was doing more in England at this moment against the Catholic cause than any other man alive. And it was he whom the Trafalgar Square incident had raised into such an eminent popularity. And now here was his mother. He turned fiercely upon the man. "I do not know what you are, sir, whether you believe in God or not, but will you swear to me on your religion and your honor that all this is true?" The timid eyes met his and wavered, but it was the wavering of weakness, not of treachery. I swear it, sir, by God Almighty." "Are you a Catholic?" The man shook his head. "But I believe in God," he says. "At least, I think so." Percy leaned back, trying to realize exactly what it all meant. There was no triumph in his mind. That kind of emotion was not his weakness. There was a fear of a kind, excitement, bewilderment, and under all a satisfaction that God's grace was so sovereign. If it could be reached, this woman, who could be too far removed for it to take effect? Presently he noticed the other looking at him anxiously. "You are afraid, sir? You are not going back on your promise?" That dispersed the cloud a little, and Percy smiled. "Oh, no," he said. "I will be there at 20 o'clock. Is death imminent?" "No, sir, it is syncope. She is recovering a little this morning." The priest passed his hand over his eyes and stood up. "Well, I will be there," he said. "Shall you be there, sir?" The other shook his head too, standing up. "I must be with Mr. Brand, sir. There is to be a meeting tonight, but must not speak of that. No, sir. Ask for Mrs. Brand, and say that she is expecting you. They will take you upstairs at once. I must not say that I am a priest, I suppose? No, sir, if you please." He drew out a pocket-book, scribbled it in a moment, tore out the sheet, and handed it to the priest. "The address, sir. Will you kindly destroy that when you have copied it? I do not wish to lose my place, sir, if it can be helped." Percy stood twisting the paper in his fingers a moment. "Why are you not a Catholic yourself?" he asked. The man shook his head mutely. Then he took up his hat and went towards the door. Percy passed a very emotional afternoon. For the last month or two, little had happened to encourage him. He had been obliged to report half a dozen more significant successions. Hardly a conversion of any kind. There was no doubt at all that the tide was setting steadily against the church. The mad act in Trafalgar Square, too, had done incalculable harm last week. Men were saying more than ever, and the papers storming, that the church's reliance on the supernatural was belied by every one of her public acts. "Scratch a Catholic and find an assassin" had been the text of a leading article in the New People, and Percy himself was dismayed at the folly of the attempt. It was true that the Archbishop had formally repudiated both the act and the motive from the cathedral pulpit, but that too had only served as an opportunity hastily taken up by the principal papers to recall the continual policy of the Church, to avail herself of violence while she was repudiated the violent. The horrible death of the man had in no way appeased popular indignation. They were not even wanting suggestions that the man had been seen coming out of the Archbishop's house an hour before the attempt at assassination had taken place. Now, here, with dramatic swiftness, had come a message that the hero's own mother desired reconciliation with the Church, that it attempted to murder her son. Again and again that afternoon, as Percy sped northwards on his visit to a priest at Worcester, and southward once more as the lights began to shine towards evening, he wondered whether this were not a plot after all, some kind of retaliation, an attempt to trap him. Yet he had promised to say nothing and to go. He finished his daily letter after dinner as usual, with a curious sense of fatality, addressed and stamped it. Then he went downstairs in his walking dress to Father Blackmore's room. "Will you hear my confession, Father?" he said abruptly. Part 2. Victoria Station, still named after the great 19th century queen, was neither more nor less busy than usual as he came into it a half-hour later. The vast platform, sunk now nearly 200 feet below the ground level, showed the double crowd of passengers entering and leaving town. Those on the extreme left, towards whom Percy began to descend in the open glazed lift, were by far the most numerous, and the stream at the lift entrance made it necessary for him to move slowly. He arrived at last, walking in the soft light on the noiseless ribbed rubber, and stood by the door of the long car that ran straight through to the junction. It was the last of a series of a dozen or more, each of which slid off minute by minute. Then, still watching the endless movement of the lifts ascending and descending between the entrances of the upper end of the station, he stepped in and sat down. He felt quiet now that he had actually started. He had made his confession, just in order to make certain of his own soul, though scarcely expecting any definite danger, and sat now, his gray suit and straw hat in no way distinguishing him as a priest, for a general leave was given by the authorities to dress so for any adequate reason. Since the case was not eminent, he had not brought stocks or picks. Father Dolan had wired to him that he might fetch them if he wished from St. Joseph's near the junction. He had only the violet thread in his pocket, such as was customary for sick calls. He was sliding along peaceably enough, fixing his eyes on the empty seat opposite, and trying to preserve complete collectedness, when the car abruptly stopped. He looked out, astonished, and saw by the white enameled walk 20 feet from the window that they were already in the tunnel. The stoppage might arise from many causes, and he was not greatly excited, nor did it seem that others in the carriage took it very seriously. He could hear, after a moment's silence, the talking recommence beyond the partition. Then there came, echoed by the walls, the sound of shouting from far away, mingled with hoots and chords. It grew louder. The talking in the carriage stopped. He heard a window thrown up, and the next instant a car tore past, going back to the station, although on the down line. This must be looked into, thought Percy. Something certainly was happening. So he got up and went across the empty compartment to the further window. Again came the crying of voices, again the signals, and once more a car whirled past, followed almost immediately by another. There was a jerk, a smooth movement. Percy staggered and fell into a seat, as the carriage in which he was seated itself began to move backwards. There was a clamor now in the next compartment, and Percy made his way there through the door, only to find half a dozen men with their heads thrust from the windows, who paid absolutely no attention to his inquiries. So he stood there, aware that they knew no more than himself, waiting for an explanation from someone. It was disgraceful, he told himself, that any misadventure should so disorganize the line. Twice the car stopped. Each time it moved on again after a hoot or two, and at last drew up at the platform whence it had started, although 100 yards farther out. Ah, there was no doubt that something had happened. The instant he opened the door, a great roar met his ears, and as he sprang onto the platform and looked up at the end of the station, he began to understand. From right to left of the huge interior, across the patterns, swelling every instant, surged an enormous, swaying, roaring crowd. The flight of steps, 20 yards broad, used only in cases of emergency, resembled a giant black cataract nearly 200 feet in height. Each car as it drew up discharged more and more men and women, who ran like ants towards the assembly of their fellows. The noise was indescribable. The shouting of men, the screaming of women, the clang and hoot of the huge machines, and 3 or 4 times the brazen cry of a trumpet, as an emergency door was flung open overhead, and a small swirl of crowd poured through it towards the streets beyond. But after one look, Percy looked no more at the people, for there, high up beneath the clock on the government signal board, flared out monstrous letters of fire, telling in Esperanto and English the message for which England had grown sick. He read it 12 times before he moved, staring at a supernatural sight which might denote a triumph of either heaven or hell. Eastern Convention dispersed. Peace, not war. Universal Brotherhood established. Felsenburgh in London tonight. Part 3. It was not until nearly 2 hours later that Percy was standing at the house beyond the junction. He had argued, expostulated, threatened, but the officials were like men possessed. Half of them had disappeared in the rush to the city, for it had leaked out, in spite of the government's precaution, that Paul's house, known once as St. Paul's Cathedral, was to be the scene of Felsenburgh's reception. The others seemed demented. One man on the platform had dropped dead from nervous exhaustion, but no one appeared to care, and the body laid huddled beneath a seat. Again and again Percy had been swept away by a rush, as he struggled from platform to platform in his search for a car that would take him to Croydon. It seemed that there was none to be had, and the useless carriages collected like driftwood between the platforms, as others whirled up from the country, bringing loads of frantic, delirious men, who vanished like smoke from the white rubber boards. The platforms were continually crowded, and as continually emptied, and it was not until a half-hour before midnight that the block began to move outward again. Well, he was here at last, disheveled, hatless, and exhausted, looking up at the dark windows. He scarcely knew what he thought of the whole matter. War, of course, was terrible, and such a war as this would have been too terrible for the imagination to visualize. But to the priest's mind there were other things even worse. What of universal peace? Peace, that is to say, established by others than Christ's methods. Or was God behind even this? The questions were hopeless. Felsenburgh. It was he who had done this thing undoubtedly greater than any secular event hitherto known in civilization. What manner of man was he? What was his character, his motive, his method? How would he use his success? So, the points flew before him like a stream of sparks. Each, it might be, harmless, each equally capable of setting a world on fire. Meanwhile, here was an old woman who desired to be reconciled with God before she died. He touched the button again, 3 or 4 times, and waited. Then a light sprang out overhead, and he knew that he was heard. "I was sent for," he exclaimed to the bewildered maid. "I should have been here at 22. I was prevented by the rush." She babbled out a question at him. "Yes, it is true, I believe," he said. "It is peace, not war. Kindly take me upstairs." He went through the hall with a curious sense of guilt. This was Brand's house, then, that vivid orator, so bitterly eloquent against God. And here was he, a priest, sneaking in under cover of night. Well, well, it was not of his appointment. At the door of an upstairs room the maid turned to him. "A doctor, sir?" she said. "That is my affair," said Percy briefly, and opened the door. A little wailing cry broke from the corner before he had time to close the door again. "Oh, thank God! I thought you had forgotten me. You are a priest, Father?" "I am a priest." "Do you not remember seeing me in the cathedral?" "Yes, yes, sir." "I saw you praying, Father. Oh, thank God, thank God." Percy stood looking down at her a moment, seeing her flushed old face in the nightcap, her bright sunken eyes and her tremulous hands. Yes, this was genuine enough. "Now, my child," he said, "tell me." "My confession, Father." Percy drew out the purple thread, slipped it over his shoulders, and sat down on the bed. But she would not let him go for a while after that. "Tell me, Father, when will you bring me Holy Communion?" He hesitated. "I understand that Mr. Brand and his wife know nothing of this?" "No, Father." "Tell me, are you very ill?" "I don't know, Father. They will not tell me. I thought I was gone last night." "Well, would you wish me to bring you Holy Communion?" "I will do as you say." "Shall I send to you in a day or two?" "Father, ought I to tell him?" "You are not obliged." "I will if I ought." "Well, think about it, and let me know. You have heard what has happened?" She nodded, almost uninterestedly, and Percy was conscious of a tiny prick of compunction at his own heart. After all, the reconciling of a soul to God was a greater thing than the reconciling of East to West. "It may make a difference to Mr. Brand," he said. "He will be a great man, now, you know." She still looked at him in silence, smiling a little. Percy was astonished at the youthfulness of that old face. Then her face changed. "Father, I must not keep you. But tell me this. Who is this man?" "Felsenburgh?" "Yes." "No one knows." "We shall know more tomorrow. He is in town tonight." She looked so strange that Percy for an instant thought it was a seizure. Her face seemed to fall away in a kind of emotion, half cunning, half fear. "Well, my child?" "Father, I am a little afraid when I think of that man. He cannot harm me, can he? I am safe now. I am a Catholic." "My child, of course you are safe. What is the matter? How can this man injure you?" But the look of terror was still there, and Percy came a step nearer. "You must not give way to fancies," he said. "Just commit yourself to our blessed Lord. This man can do you no harm." He was speaking now as to a child, but it was of no use. Her old mouth was still sucked in, and her eyes wandered past him into the gloom of the room behind. "My child, tell me what is the matter. What do you know of Felsenburgh? You have been dreaming." She nodded suddenly and energetically, and Percy for the first time felt his heart give a little leap of apprehension. Was this old woman out of her mind, then? Or why was it that that name seemed to him sinister? Then he remembered that Father Blackmore had once talked like this. He made an effort and sat down once more. "Now tell me plainly," he said. "You have been dreaming. What have you dreamt?" She raised herself a little in bed, again glancing around the room. Then she put out her old ringed hand for one of his, and he gave it, wondering. "The door is shut, Father. There is no one listening?" "No, no, my child. Why are you trembling? You must not be superstitious." "Father, I will tell you. Dreams are nonsense, are they not? Well, at least this is what I dreamt. I was somewhere in a great house. I do not know where it was. It was a house I have never seen. It was one of the old houses, and it was very dark. I was a child, I thought, and I was afraid of something. The passages were all dark, and I went crying in the dark, looking for a light, and there was none. Then I heard a voice talking, a great way off. Father," her hand gripped his more tightly, and again her eyes went round the room. With great difficulty Percy repressed a sigh. Yet he dared not leave her just now. The house was very still. Only from outside now and again sounded the clang of the cars, as they sped countrywards again from the congested town, and once the sound of great shouting. He wondered what time it was. "Had you better tell me now?" he asked, still talking with a patient simplicity. "What time will they be back?" "Not yet," she whispered. "Mabel said not till 2 o'clock. What time is it now, Father?" He pulled out his watch with his disengaged hand. "It is not yet 1, he said. "Very well. Listen, Father. I was in this house, and I heard that talking, and I ran along the passages, till I saw light below a door, and then I stopped. Nearer, Father." Percy was a little awed in spite of himself. Her voice had suddenly dropped to a whisper, and her old eyes seemed to behold him strangely. "I stopped, Father. I dare not go in. I could hear the talking, and I could see the light, and I dared not go in. Father, it was Felsenburgh in that room." From beneath came the sudden snap of a door, then the sound of footsteps. Percy turned his head abruptly. At the same moment he heard a swift, indrawn breath from the old woman. "Hush," he said. "Who is that?" 2 voices were talking in the hall now, and at the sound the old woman relaxed her hold. I thought it to be him," she murmured. Percy stood up. He could see that she did not understand the situation. "Yes, my child," he said quietly, "but who is it?" "My son and his wife," she said. Then her face changed once more. Why, Father." Her voice died in her throat as a step vibrated outside. For a moment there was complete silence. Then a whisper, plainly audible, in a girl's voice. "Why, her light is burning. Come in, Oliver, but softly." Then the handle turned.